It's Thursday, February 6th, and welcome to the New York Amsterdam News Podcast. I'm Cyril Josh Barker, coming to you from the offices of the New York Amsterdam News in Harlem. On this week's podcast, my special guest is attorney Laurie Daniel Favors, Interim Director of the City for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College. She's going to discuss the importance of the Black community's participation in the 2020 census. New York City is spending $40 million on the NYC Complete Count campaign to ensure the city's full participation in the 2020 U.S. Census. Attorney Laurie Daniel Favors is on the team of community leaders getting the word out to Black New Yorkers about being counted. She's with me on the phone now to discuss her work with the effort. Welcome to the podcast, Laurie. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. So let's just kind of get into it right now here about this 2020 census. You are one of many community leaders that are out there that are doing some wonderful things with the census. And I just want to kind of just go over why this is so important and your connection to it, why you decided to get involved.
Sure, absolutely. So, I work at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College, where I am privileged to serve as the Interim Executive Director. And this is actually, as an institution, going to be our fourth census cycle. So we were founded in 1980s, and our Executive Director, Esmeralda Simmons, who recently retired, she has always laid down a foundation of making sure that we are all clear about the role that the census plays for communities of African descent, and how that is tied to every other resource, every other opportunity that we have within our communities, or quite frankly, the opportunities and resources that we don't have in our communities. And so when you understand how the census is tied to every single dollar that we rely on, every single dollar that funds every single service that we need, whether it be WIC, SNAP, schools, after-school programs, teachers, hospitals, affordable housing, even infrastructure to keep our communities clean, all of that is tied in some way to the census. And then when you add on top of that the fact that our community's census count also determines how many political representatives are assigned to us. It determines where our political geographic boundary lines are drawn and what really defines our communities. It really is something that is at the heart of our ability to really engage in what we consider the American process. And so when you understand how it is tied to what we're dealing with as a people, you recognize it's just vitally important for people of African descent to really be engaged in this in a different way.
Okay. Earlier this week, I was at the African American or African Descent Media Roundtable at City Hall, and there were a lot of issues talked about when it comes to the census. One of them being that a lot of folks aren't filling it out. We had, I think, in the story that we did today, there was only just a 61.9% response rate in 2010, and 40 to 50%. Only the response rate was even lower for African Americans or Black communities. It was 40 to 50%. Tell us about some of the reasons why a lot of our folks didn't fill it out the last time, still might be a little skeptical about filling it out this time.
Well, when you think about the history of African descendant people in this country, it really does make sense that we would have a lot of fear, and it makes sense that we would have a lot of lack of information as it pertains to how these systems work. So the first time that people of African descent show up on the census, and just a note, I'm saying people of African descent intentionally, and we can talk about the racial dynamics later, but that is an intentional thing. I just like to point that out for people.
Right.
But the first time that people of African descent show up on the census is back in 1790, and on that census, we showed up as 3/5 of a person. And the reason for that was because the more people you have in your community, the more, as I said earlier, the more political power and fiscal financial resources your community gets. So by showing up as only 3/5 of a person, that was the North's way of ensuring that the South wasn't going to have a completely oversized amount of power based on Black bodies that they held in bondage, but were not willing to represent and were not willing to center in any way other than in a slave status. But even after 1790, we know that when the government comes knocking on our door and asking questions and is requesting information, the responses for Black people, typically the results are not typically very good. So it could be, during the slave era, when people come knocking on your door demanding information about who's inside, your loved one might be sold away the next day. You might be victimized in ways that are going to leave your entire family structure completely undone. It might be even in the days after slavery that your child fit a description and they were going to be then taken into the convict leasing system. Even today, we know that when the government knocks on our door, it's often in the form of police violence, or for people who are part of the immigrant community, it's a fear that ICE is showing up. And so we have a lot of reasons to be fearful, because we also recognize that this system is often very good at manipulating data and manipulating statistics in a way that's going to further the interests of white supremacy, whether that be in leadership, whether that be in policy. And so there are rational reasons that Black people do not want to fill out that census form. However, what we also have to recognize is that, there's a verse in the good book that says our people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge and lack of basic understanding as to how the census is tied to every single service that we need is really at the heart of why it is that we don't show up in the way that we do. You mentioned earlier that the response rate for a lot of Black and brown communities was between 40 and 50%. And what we need people to understand is how that low response rate then translates into our everyday life. So if you live in a community that had a 40% response rate on the census, what that means is that for the next 10 years, each of those years for the next 10 years, you are only going to be getting 40 cents on the dollar for every service that you need. So if we give the example of children going to school, if you have a community that has, for example, say 100 children, and based on the census formula for that year, every family in that community should get $100 per child based on their census count. Well, if only 40% of the community fills out the census, only 40 families fill out the census, that means that community is only going to get 40% of the total amount of money they were supposed to have. But what happens in September is all 100 children show up for school. And so all 100 of those children have to have their education needs met on the budget that was only appropriate for 40 of those children. So the same thing goes when it comes to, as I mentioned, infrastructure just in our everyday affairs. When I go down to Park Slope or Burm Hill, which are some very non-Black portions of Brooklyn, you might find a trash can on every single corner of every single intersection. Mm-hmm. But if you're in my community in Bed-Stuy, if you're in Harlem, or if you're in a space that's very, very very prevalently Black that has a low census rate response, you might walk for blocks before you find a trash can where you can dispose of garbage. So even if I want to maintain my community's cleanliness, even if I want to maintain the health and sanctity of my community, I don't have the physical infrastructure to do so, to dispose of that garbage, because my community didn't realize that even the garbage and the trash cans are tied in some way to census dollars and the allocation of funds. Right. So, when you think about the hospitals that we've lost in the city of New York, or you think about how long you have to wait for an emergency room bed when you do go to the emergency room beds are funded in part by census, by population. And if your population is only showing up at 40% on that census count, you're going to get enough funding for 40% of the beds that you're entitled to. So, when we think about, it's not effective for us as social justice or civil rights activists to go in and start talking about, well, the census is your duty and it's your obligation to fill out the census. Nobody cares. That's not what we care about. They care about food. They care about schools. They care about the fact that if you live in a community with a low census response rate, you're probably also going to be in a food desert or in a space that doesn't have access to high quality, healthy food. So every battle that we're fighting for is in some way tied to funding and our access to resources. And the census is the primary tool by which this government determines how many resources each of our communities are going to get.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. One of the things that you mentioned at the roundtable this week is that there's something different about the question when it comes to race and ethnicity and nationality. And I want you to talk about that, because you talked about that at the roundtable and you were very passionate about it. Could you please tell us about the change when it comes to asking questions about race and ethnicity on the census this year?
Absolutely. So for the first time on the 2020 census, people of African descent are going to be able to indicate not just their race, but also their nationality. And that's a really big deal because, within the Black community, within the Pan-African community, we all have very different opinions about the word Black. On my mom's side of the family, which is Jamaican, you say the word Black, it has a certain meaning. It's a very Americanized meaning. On my father's side, which is African American, you say the word Black and it's, hey, I'm Black and I'm proud. If you're from Trinidad, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Nigeria, Ghana, you may have a very specific understanding about the label Black and to whom it applies, and you may be very clear that you do not identify under that label, which is fine, and that is your right. right. And like I said before, I'm not here to try to convince other people that they should be black and proud, although I am black and proud, and I think it is something about which you should wave mountaintops. But what's important, what we tend to see happening is that in past census cycles, people who come from those different spaces, or people who don't like the term black, and quite frankly, this is also an issue within Black American communities. A lot of us, may not want to identify as black. Some may prefer African American. That we sort of know the etymology and the changes in the ways we've identified from color to Negro to Afro-American, African American. And so there's not a whole lot of necessarily agreement about that term. But what happens is in past census cycles, if you're from Nigeria or if you're from Jamaica, you might write on the census, well, I'm Nigerian, I'm Jamaican, because in Nigeria and Jamaica, we don't identify as black in the way that Black Americans do. So what you end up having is an entire segment of our population that is black for American purposes, not identifying as such. What that does is it minimizes the amount of numbers of people of African descent that we actually have showing up on the census, and it makes it extremely difficult as a voting rights lawyer to go into court and talk about black people when half of the black population you're trying to advocate for doesn't show up in the total number and population count. So for the first time in 2020, we're going to be able to, and this is something that people had to fight for, right? So a lot of times I hear people say, well, how come we can't have this designation on the census? And how come we can't be called that on the census?
Right,
listen,
I've heard that too.
You can do what you want. Yeah, just get in the streets and start organizing and make it happen. Engage with the Census Bureau. It takes years to get changes made to the census. And so it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. So if you're serious about that, there are ways that can be done. But as a result of a lot of hard work that people put in, we now, for the first time on the 2020 census, will be able to indicate nationality and race. And that's going to be a first for people of African descent. So what that means is if you're from Jamaica, you can write in, my nationality is Jamaica, but my race is black. And so we are reminding people, you have got to, regardless of your nationality, you have got to check black on the census, regardless of how you feel about it. Why? Because in this American society, which frankly we all know does not have a good grasp at all on how to deal with race, and we don't even, that's a whole other podcast. But in this society, there are certain racial protected categories that trigger certain civil rights protections, certain voting rights protections. If you show up as just Trinidadian, or if you show up as just Haitian on the census, you are not going to be able to be under the umbrella of the protection of black, which is a protected racial category. Why? Trinidadian, Haitian, Nigerian, Jamaican, Alabamian, Georgian, none of those are protected racial categories. They're nationalities, which is something very, very different. And so we are very excited about this because we want people to know, listen, you can wave your flag, you can, identify as however you want to identify with your nationality. God, go with God, take your Ancestry.com, take your 23andMe and be proud. Wave your flag and use your bumper stickers. But once you've indicated your nationality on the census, you have got to check black, because black is a protected racial category that is tied to the distribution of so many rights and protections. And if you don't do that, you're essentially undermining the very protections that we need in order to sustain what's happening with our communities now.
Wonderful. Very good information to know. And I know that at the discussion, like I said before, you mentioned that and you were very passionate about it. It's so important that we know that that's available to us. I want to talk a little bit about the process, because you just talked about one change, about a question on the census, but there is a change this time on the census, is that people can do it online. I know in the previous census that I've done, I did the last one and of course one before, it was by paper. It was by mail. You filled it out and you mailed it back. But this year, you can do it in some different ways. Tell us about that.
That's right. So one of the interesting things about this moment is that in addition to having that option for as it pertains to race, you will not be able to also submit the census online. And what's going to happen is the week of March 12th, the Census Bureau is going to be sending out postcards. And those postcards to every address that they have on file are going to have a unique identification number tied to the address. And so if you're excited about online everything, you take that number, you can pick up your phone, you can pick up your tablet, you can log onto your desktop and literally answer the census from the comfort of a screen. But now, let's say maybe you're not as excited about all digital everything, and and I get it. My grandmother, there was no way she was going to be filling out any information on anybody's screen, and it was going to be a waste of time for me to try to convince her. What we also need to be aware of is that in addition to being online, you can also pick up the phone and call in your answers to the Census Bureau. You can also mail in a paper form, and so you have three options that are going to allow you to participate in this exercise. exercised. And once either of those three options are exercised, what you don't have to worry about is an enumerator coming to your door. That's very important. So for people who don't know, after a few months of asking people to self-respond on the census, and we really do need people to self-respond because, quite frankly, nobody knows your household like you do.
Exactly.
But what happens after a few months of getting people to self-respond, the Federal Census Bureau will send out people who are called enumerators. And those enumerators basically go knocking door to door and at addresses that have not submitted the census and ask them if they'd be willing to fill out the census form with them. Now, you and I both know if some stranger comes knocking at your door, the likelihood of you opening it, let alone even acknowledging that you're home. I remember, I've had some family members, a stranger knocks at the door and everyone has to be quiet. I don't know who's at the door. I don't want them to know I'm home.
I remember those
right?
days.
So,
yeah, absolutely. I think I still do
right.
them now a little bit.
Hey, I'm not mad at you. But the reality is if you've already submitted a census either online, by phone, or by mail, nobody's coming to your door. Mm-hmm. So that's because we're really living in a time right now where strangers knocking at doors can sometimes be very dangerous figures, right? If you're part of the immigrant community, the last thing you want is someone coming to your door. You need to exercise one of these three options as soon as you can so that you're no longer included in the list of households that need to have a door knock. So it's online, by phone, or by mail, and the city and our organization, the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, along with over 100 other organizations, have been partnering with the city of New York to ensure that we are engaging our faith-based institutions. Our libraries are going to be involved. We're asking churches and religious houses of worship to have what we call pop-up centers, where literally you can have a bank of laptops in your church basement, go on and listen to the pastor and a good sermon upstairs, and come on downstairs, maybe eat some good food, and sit down in front of a computer and fill out your census.
That's wonderful.
We at the Center for Law and Social Justice are going to be targeting hair salons and barbershops and daycare centers, really because those are spaces where we gather, and we know what we like to do.
Exactly,
So we need to be in the spaces where we're at so that we can educate our community, let them know what's happening, because quite frankly, I've talked with people from childhood up until senior citizen, and many of them, I had one gentleman tell me, he said, "Ma'am, I am 69 years old, I have 2 master's degrees, I am very well educated, and I never had a clue as to what the census was. I always thought it was the man trying to get me and try to fire me." And I said, "Well, sir, I thank you for that. But one thing we need to be clear of is if the man wants anything as it pertains to black people, the man does not want us filling it out. Why? Because it's a zero-sum game in some ways. If we don't fill out that, if we don't show up on the census and other communities do, they get all of the resources that we leave on the table. And we got to be aware of that because white communities do not tend to have this problem. If you are a part of a white community, you know that in your history, when the government asks you for information, they're going to give you good things, like in the Homestead Act, where they clear all the Native Americans off the land, and they said to white people, go out and west, you can grab up 5 acres of land, create a house, get a farm, we're going to turn you into landowners and homeowners overnight. When white people come back from the wars, they didn't have issues using their GI Bills and getting their Veterans Affairs benefits the way black people did. So white communities have a very, traditionally, there are always exceptions, of course, but they have a very different relationship to the census, which means when all of us black and brown people leave those resources on the table, they scoop them up. So it's time to make that a lot more equitable.
Absolutely. And I just want to make a mention, you were talking about the pop-up shops and the libraries where you can fill out the census. Just want to make a quick note that the city has spent $40 million, the NYC Complete Count campaign. That's $40 million for people to be able to fill out the census. Because while I did mention earlier that about the numbers, just want to read it again. In 2010, New York City's self-response rate of to the census was 61.9%, whereas the national average was 76%. So, definitely an effort here. I think they were saying at the roundtable discussion that this is the largest amount of money that probably the city, and I believe any municipality has been spending for the census. So, this is really, really serious. I do want to talk about something that we discussed also in the article that we did this week and at the roundtable discussion, and that is there are scammers out there. We see them during tax season. We see them online. I do know a couple people. I know some folks, a couple people in my family have been victims of scams, not with the census, but with other things where someone will call. You were telling folks and talking about how be just as vigilant when it comes to the census, because it might be a way for people to get your personal information if they're not. Can you talk a little bit about that and how this happens with the scamming?
Absolutely. So one thing people need to know is that when it comes to the actual Census Bureau, your information is maintained confidential. And that's very important for people to know. Title 13 of the U.S. Code absolutely prohibits the distribution of any individual census data to anybody. And every single person who works at the Census Bureau takes an oath. And if they violate that oath of confidentiality, not only do they face up to a 5-year prison term, and I'm talking federal prison, they also face a fine of up to $250,000. And so it's very important that people are clear about what is going to be asked of them on the census and what is not. For example, your social security number is not going to be asked on the census. They are going to ask you about they're going to ask your name, your age, who lives with you in the home, your race, and they ask these things because that's how they figure out, well, do you guys need money for schools, for early childhood, or do you need senior citizen centers? So if everyone in your house is under the age of 5, then that lets the Census Bureau know, hey, there are families here who have very young children, and we need to make sure that they're getting the bulk of money for pre-K or the bulk of money for early childhood intervention and servicing programs. Whereas if you respond to the census and you indicate that everyone in your house is over the age of 65, then the Census Bureau knows that, hey, this community needs transportation services that can accommodate the bodies of senior citizens, which age differently, and they may need walkers, they may need wheelchairs, and so we need to make sure that the buses have the space to actually accommodate that. When it comes to the questions that they're being asked, what we like to tell people is basically you're going to give more information to Amazon than you are more personal information to Amazon making an online order than you are with the census.
That's definitely
so if
true.
you have people coming to your door asking you things like your social security number or asking you questions that or asking you for credit card information, that's not somebody from the Census Bureau because they are not interested in your social security number. They're not interested in your credit card. You know then that you are most likely being scammed. And that's something that you need to shut the door on that quickly. Okay. And if you have questions about that, you can call 311 and say census, and they will be able to connect you to the New York City Census office. I'm always a fan of telling people, you know what, ask them for their business card. If someone comes to your door and asks you questions, ask them for a business card, and then call up and find out if this is legitimate before you answer any information.
Right. I just want to add that Census Bureau employees will have a valid ID badge with their photograph.
That's right.
A U.S. Department of Commerce watermark and expiration date. And just want to add that the census will not ask you for immigration or citizenship status, income like you were saying, social security number, bank account card, credit card number, money or donations. We hear a lot about that. Mother's maiden name, political affiliation. Those are some things they will not be asking you. So that's very important. Just wanted to make that note out there.
And the citizenship question is really big because the Trump administration really did try to make that appear on the census. And the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College, we were a part of that legal battle, and we represented the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus in front of the Southern District of New York as amici to let the court know, listen, this citizenship question is going to strike fear in the hearts of our communities. It is going to ensure confusion. And so we were very excited to see that question stricken from the census. But we need people to know that they are not going to be asking you about citizenship on the census. And so that's a very good thing.
All right. Lastly, I just want to, if you can give some information that people can go to learn more about the census. It's literally a month away. This is going to be a process. It's going to be a while. And also give some deadlines because that's something that people need to know as well in order to know this is not something we need to sit on. We need to act kind of as soon as we get it and kind of get it done because it doesn't take long. I remember when I did it in 2010, I live alone. So obviously it didn't take long for me, but it didn't take, I think for anybody, it shouldn't take too long. So if you can give us some websites, some phone numbers, some places that we can, we should be looking out for.
Absolutely. So we've put together a bit of a resource guide on our website, which is clsj.org/censusjustice. And we encourage people to go there. We have materials available for distribution. We have information about how the census is going to impact local New York City communities. You can also visit census.gov if you want information from the Federal Bureau site. And the New York City Census Office is also very good for information. And you can visit them. Hold on, I want to make sure I give you the right site.
Okay.
If you
it's fine,
make sure. if you go to www.one.nyc.gov/census, you'll be able to find information on their site as well. As it pertains to deadlines, so March 12th, that week is when people should start checking their mail. And I say that intentionally because I got to be honest with you, I used to be, when I was in private practice, I represented people who were basically in bankruptcy and in debt foreclosure and had a whole lot of financial issues. And I became very aware that many people do not check their physical mail.
That is so true.
We need you. We need you to do that. You've got to start looking for your postcard in the mail. And if you are more interested in calling up online, you will have information where you will be able to pick up that phone number, call it in. And like you said, do it as soon as you can. It's 10 questions, 10 minutes that will literally determine the funding and the political representation for the next 10 years. On April 1st, that's considered Census Day. It would be so fantastic if everyone had completed the census by April 1st. And I mean, trust me, a whole lot of us would be sleeping a lot better at night. But there's going to be a whole slew of activities all across the city to really encourage people who have not yet filled out the census to really get that in. Now, what we believe is that by the end of May, mid-June, you're going to start seeing enumerators coming out. And that's, again, where people are going to be knocking on doors who are from the Census Bureau, assuming that we're dealing with folks who are not on the scam side.
Right.
And they're going to start asking people who have not filled out the census to fill it out. So, again, if you don't want that to happen, get your census in, either online, on phone, or by mail.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much, Laurie Favors. I've known you for a very long time, and it's so nice to talk to you. I forgot to say that, but it's so nice to be speaking with you. And, as
Likewise.
the Amsterdam News, I just want to put out there that the city is working with Black media in order to make sure that we're doing our part. And this podcast is a great example of the work that we're doing here at the Amsterdam News to get out the word about the census and get people to fill it out. So thank you again for partnering with us, and we really appreciate it. We really appreciate it.
Likewise.
That concludes this week's podcast. You can pick up the latest edition of the New York Amsterdam News on newsstands and get updates online at amsterdamnews.com. You can also keep up with us on Facebook at NY Amsterdam News and follow us on Twitter at NYAmNews. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. Thanks for listening.